Today, I want to walk you through the start to finish process that I used to bring this painterly expressive portrait to life, all in just a couple of hours. So if you really love expressive bravura style alla prima portraiture, you're gonna want to watch this one through all the way to the end. So first things first, we need to talk about planning before we actually get into the painting itself. So I'm gonna walk you through the initial steps that I took before I even put brush to canvas in order to set this particular piece up for success, because it really does make a tremendous difference. Well, let's go ahead and dive in by talking about the planning stages of this particular painting. This is one of the most underrated steps that anyone takes, and I want to make sure I'm giving this plenty of due because honestly it's such an important part of your painting practice. I can tell you right now, chances are there's more that you can be doing to plan your pieces and really set them up for success. So let me go ahead and show you what I did to set this piece up for success. I have a snippet of my curated inspiration board over here on the right. I've made a lot of videos about this before. If you're not familiar with this idea, I'll go ahead and link a video up above walking you through exactly what this is and how you create one for yourself. I would go ahead and put together one of these if you haven't already, but for this particular painting, I have already looked at this plenty of times. I have a really solid understanding of what this board really says about what I should be painting. For instance, these pieces are basically entirely of people. You know, I shouldn't be spending a whole lot of time doing like floral bouquet paintings based on what this board suggests about what I'm going to gravitate toward, feel inspired by, and enjoy making. These feature like really calligraphic, bold brushwork. A lot of the backgrounds are just bold brushwork. There's not like a lot of rendering or detail in them. In fact, for this little snippet of the board, it's interesting because there isn't one super clear background in all of these. And these tend to be pretty light, pretty high key, fairly neutral. Obviously, we have some paintings that like really go closer to the pinks and the reds. But all in all, there's a lot of neutrality in terms of the color schemes here. So with that in mind, I have gone ahead and I've made a gigantic photo album of all of the different like portrait reference packs that I have purchased over the years. And I took the time to comb through thousands of images and select and then filter the ones that I thought I would really enjoy painting. So I removed any where I didn't like the poses or the lighting or the costuming, if applicable. And here's a little snippet of what I was left with. And after taking a look at this, I looked for a piece that honestly, like I wanted a reference that was just speaking to me. And this is what I chose. Now, one obvious kind of disconnect between this piece and what I had on my board is that this background is quite dark. Now, when it comes to the figure, you know, the costuming, the posing, the expression, this definitely is compatible with the board, but the background really wasn't. So I needed to figure out a way that I could adjust this background to make it work better. And there were two pieces, so these horses and then this particular portrait. The horses are a Sally Martin piece. The portrait, I like looked high and low to actually find the original artist's name, and I only was able to find the person who reposted it, unfortunately. But I really liked how the background was handled in these, and I thought that the overall colors could potentially work with this image. So what I did next was I mocked this up, and the way that I did this was I took my panel and I masked in some of those background washy strokes, and then I essentially inserted this underneath the like cut out figure. And when I took these initial steps, I realized like, hey, I really like the way this is looking. I already kind of had this feeling that I would like how the colors in her would work really well with colors that I used for this initial wash, like transparent oxide red, ultramarine, a little bit of, oh, I forget if I used like dioxazine purple because I had it on the palette that day, or if I used something like permanent magenta, or excuse me, permanent rose in my case, to create more of these purpley tones. But all of these were colors that I kind of saw in the portrait initially. And so I loved the way that this actually came together in the mock-up form. And then one final thing that I needed to do was I needed to make sure that the crop of this mock-up actually matched the crop of the panel that I was working on, which is super simple. I just made sure that I went ahead and set the ratio to 12:16, which is what I was painting on for this particular piece, and cropped it in accordingly, and made sure that I really liked the placement of the figure and the brushwork within that particular aspect ratio. Once I was satisfied with this, I was ready to go ahead and dive into the painting. And I can't overstate just how helpful it really was to be able to look at this mock-up while I was painting, because truthfully, there's a pretty big leap between this reference and this mock-up. Obviously, like, she is unchanged, but the feeling of the piece is very different with this brushwork. And I did wind up kind of retooling and playing with this brushwork quite a bit, which ultimately meant that I was afforded the opportunity to see what was working and make adjustments because I did this step in the very beginning. And ultimately, all I had to do from there on out was to just focus on translating the portrait onto the panel rather than doing a lot of like guessing and checking. This would not have turned out nearly as like light and airy and beautifully if I had started by massing in a solid dark background like we see in this particular version. Let's dive into the painting. So I'm going to talk you through what I had on my palette and what tools I was using, because I do think that it's helpful to kind of get those pieces out of the way. The overwhelming majority of my paints on my palette are by Vasari. I think I just happened to have a leftover tube of one color that was in Winsor Newton that I had out, but I'm working off of my pretty standard portrait palette for this particular piece. So I have here titanium white, yellow ochre, terra rosa, transparent oxide red. Typically I would have transparent oxide brown on the palette as well, but on this particular day I just didn't put it out. The great thing about transparent oxide brown is that if you have transparent oxide red, you can essentially recreate transparent oxide brown by just mixing some transparent oxide red with ultramarine blue, which is what I did on this particular day. Then I have permanent rose, which this is one of the Winsor Newton colors that I just had left over that happened to still be on my palette. In Vasari, this would be ruby red. And by the way, I have a Vasari link in the description if you happen to want to get some of these Vasari colors. And then I have ultramarine and viridian. I have a little bit left over dioxazine purple. I'll be honest, I don't even know what brand this was. I had it out for the Jinx painting that you might have seen on my channel recently, which required a lot of specialty purples. I don't use them very often, so I think I just had those and like some older brands that I don't use quite as much anymore, like Winsor Newton or Gamblin. And then my medium for this was Gamblin's solvent-free gel. Now, I did use a little bit of Gamsol in the beginning stages. This is how I got the wash at the early stages of this particular piece. I used a pretty stiff bristle brush, paint that's thinned with Gamsol, and then when I have the overall marks looking pretty good, I would use a Viva paper towel to essentially like flatten a lot of that information. So I would get a really crisp edge and some interesting texture right at the boundary of these marks, but then the overall passage of color inside of it would ultimately kind of unify and harmonize and not distract from the level of rendering and contrast that we have in the figure. But then once the wash was established, I pretty much just switched to using the solvent-free gel. That being said, the nice thing about Vasari is it already has a consistency I really like, so I find myself adding a lot less medium into my mixtures because it's typically just like already ready to go. So I already covered the initial step that I took on here, which was to go ahead and just like lay down some abstract brush marks that were going to be representative of the background. Those colors were ultramarine blue deep, transparent oxide red, and then there might have been some of either the dioxazine or the permanent magenta to get some of these purples down at the bottom. And from here, the next thing that I really wanted to make sure that I did was to go ahead and establish the major anchor points for this image. So for instance, I really wanted to capture where is the top of her head, where is the bottom of her jaw, where's the eye line, where's the base of the nose, where's the crease in the lips. Similarly, where are the right and left hand edges of her arms or shoulders? Where is the neckline falling? What are the vertical lines where the hair is falling? I wanted to go ahead and really establish these anchor points in the beginning and fix them before I got too deep into this particular piece. Now, to double check the drawing, what I typically find is simplest is to go ahead and use Photoshop to be able to compare your reference to your actual painting in progress and do like a transparent overlay to essentially see what is the difference between the marks that you've put down to represent certain landmarks and where those landmarks actually are on the reference. I will link to a video that shows you exactly how to go through this full process so that you can check your drawing for yourself. But once the drawing was in pretty good shape, what was so fun about this piece, what just like really made it super enjoyable, is that I could honestly just sketch. I focused a lot of time and attention on just the features of the face. So much of her corset, her hair, her arms, they're really just underpainting. The shadow under her neck is really just underpainting. And so as a result, I could really focus on specifically, am I putting the essential areas of light and shadow in the right spot? What I really focused on in this piece to get this result is that I wanted the early stages of the painting to look as beautiful as possible. And that's part of what enabled me to leave so much of this underpainting there. By really establishing what are the shadow patterns that make this eye look like her eye, or what does the shadow under the nose need to look like to really make it look like her nose? How can I put down this like squiggly mark of the hair in a way where it'll be visually interesting? This made such a big difference. It allowed me to paint way more efficiently. And it also essentially gave me permission to leave good enough alone. You know, there could have been so many places where I could have busted out the one-haired brush and like really gone to town on a particular area, worrying so much about the detail. And really, by just focusing on how efficiently I could get a beautiful result, there were so many places where I just let the edges start to get lost, or I could convey an area in just a few brush strokes and leave it alone because I could recognize the beauty of those brush strokes. Now, I want to make something very clear. My ability to do this has absolutely come with time and practice. It's not the kind of thing that you can just expect yourself to prepare for and then successfully execute all in an afternoon. This has been the result of dozens and dozens of portrait paintings where this was my goal. You know, how can I get in a really beautiful block in? How can I really capture the likeness in under 20 brush strokes? How can I make sure that the likeness is there before I do anything else on the painting, and especially before I get into something like rendering? Ultimately, I just had so much fun painting this piece, and it's because I let those building blocks fall into place over time. That being said, I'm not just kind of coming into the studio asking to fall into flow. I have absolutely set myself up for success on this journey. You know, I mentioned this Pinterest board at the beginning of this video. This was such a large part of my journey and what set me up for success. It's the fact that I had a structure to follow, and I understood that that structure was building me up to a specific end goal that I had in mind. I wasn't just kind of coming into the studio, winging it, and then hoping that magically I would end up at my desired end point. So I had to start by really thoughtfully constructing that Pinterest board and my vision for my goal. And then from there, I had to realize, like, what are the essential skills that I would have to build to paint the way that I saw in my vision board. And one of the skills that I've been thinking about for a really long time is that all of my favorite painters would have these underpaintings or these block-ins that just by themselves looked so painterly and energetic and beautiful. And that was a really big part of my goal. And so I've been kind of sneaking my way up to being able to achieve that result over a pretty long amount of time. But because I knew what the goal was, and because I could break it down into those little tiny constituent parts, like really mastering the block-in, like having the skills to really nail the likeness, like being able to convey color in a way that looks subtle and harmonious, but still really realistic and convincing. All of those were particular skills that I had to practice and hone. Same thing when it comes to things like brushwork. It took me quite a lot of practice to learn what brushes in my kit actually make these beautiful marks in the beginning. But that was something that I built up over time, just like I built up the drawing over time, just like I practiced my block-in over time. But I hope that seeing this particular piece unfold gives you inspiration, gives you this feeling that, like, this really is possible and that you have a clear idea of what it looks like to get there. Now, if this is the kind of structure that you would benefit from, or if you really want to be able to create this kind of painting for yourself in this coming year, as we embark on 2025 and all that has to bring creatively to us, I would love to help. There's a link down in the description below to reach out to me to be able to find out if we would be a fit to work together. I would love to use that complimentary strategy session to really help put together what the action plan would look like for you specifically based on your unique goals and what you've been coming up against on your quest to get this kind of painterly effect in your artwork. I hope that this piece and watching it unfold has given you a lot of inspiration. I know that just looking at it, I honestly feel really energized to dive right back into the studio and work on the next piece. So let me know what you're excited to paint down in the comments, and I hope you all have had a wonderful holiday season. And until the next video, happy painting.